Well, central to everything COVID is the role of China, its increasing assertiveness, its position in the world, its position in our region, its position in regards to our economy. Joining me now to discuss this is somebody who knows an awful lot about this subject. Greg Sheridan, foreign editor of The Australian. Welcome, Greg.
Great to be with you, Nick.
Now, I should just point out, for those who are not familiar with your background in its entirety, you know what you're talking about on this subject. Your relationship with China, if I could put it back like that, goes back at least to the 1980s when you were foreign correspondent for The Australian in Beijing. That's right, isn't it?
That's right, in 1985. So, Nick, my claim to being a footnote, if not an erratum in journalistic history, is that I was the first correspondent the Australian newspaper ever sent to China. 1985 was a radically different China from today. My other footnote in history, I was the first journalist that a young diplomat named Kevin Rudd ever briefed. And obviously he found the experience agreeable because he's never stopped briefing journalists ever since.
Never stopped talking, I think, Greg.
Yeah. China then was just a different planet. You know, there were hardly any cars on the street. People were in blue Mao jackets. There were great waves of bicycles flowing down the street, and it was a liberalising period, and people thought there might be no end. You know, the liberalisation might go all the way in China. It was an optimistic period as well. I'm lucky to have had that experience, really.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a late comer to this. My first visit to China was 1993, but I remember landing at Beijing airport and getting the bus in along, you know, sort of very crowded street with horses and carts,
Yes.
the whole works, right? And then I came back, I think, within 6 months, that had all gone, and the pace of China's growth at that phase just amazed me, and even more so
In
today.
1985, the taxi driver on the way in from the airport kept turning his headlights off to save electricity. I mean, that's the China of that period. But I'm glad to have been there then because I saw the old China. It was the last wash of communism, which was horrible, of course, but it was a decayed, decrepit, liberalising communism, and there were elements of it that had a certain sweetness. You know, there was an innocence and naivety to people in their first contacts with the West, but that all got swept away itself pretty fast too.
Let's talk about that, because I think this is very important to where we are now. So, at that period, say between Nixon going to China in that famous gesture and Tiananmen Square, 4 years after you were there, or after you arrived at any rate, there was this almost universal certainty amongst China watchers, as we call them, that with the economic opening up, the economic liberalisation, would come a democratic opening up. Is that true?
Yes, that's right, Nick. The only two China watchers I'd say who never really got China wrong were Pierre Ryckmans, the late Pierre Ryckmans, and Jeremy Barmay, who was for a time at the ANU. But the history of China watching is that China watchers get it wrong every single time. So better not to take them too seriously. China watchers for a time, of course, thought Mao was the wave of the future, but he unleashed terrible chaos on China in the Cultural Revolution. Things got better when Deng Xiaoping came to power and instituted economic reform. But I can remember there in the mid-'80s when I was there, people thinking that, I remember the late Sir Peter Abels, a very fine man, talking the most sublime rubbish about China, saying that it would become a more purely capitalist and more democratic society even than Australia. And a lot of Chinese themselves thought democracy was the logical next point. You know, I remember being briefed by the deputy editor of the People's Daily that democracy didn't suit a big poor country, but it would get there eventually. And so we thought that liberalisation would work. That was crushed at Tiananmen Square, although in reality the party never believed in liberalisation. The party leadership thought modernisation was important, and they were a bit confused about how far you had to democratise to become modern and how Western you had to become to become modern. That was a debate all over Asia. Did modernization equal westernization? Then at the time of the Tiananmen massacre, every jackass with an op-ed column said, well, the party has lost all credibility with the people now. Don't worry that the Hong Kong handover is happening in 1997. The party is on its last legs. Liberalism will flow through. 1997 came. Everybody was worried that China would immediately crack down. It didn't immediately crack down. Then everybody was optimistic that Hong Kong would change China more than China changed Hong Kong, and that it would slowly liberalise and there'd be the birth of a legal system. I must have written 100 articles myself about the Chinese legal system, and that China had institutionalised, gone past one-man rule. Then Xi Jinping came to power in a way that people hadn't foreseen. He then smashed up all Chinese institutionalism, got rid of term limits, got rid of all constraints on his own power, centralised every single position in himself: Party Secretary General, President of the State, Chairman of the Military Commission, and 1,000 other titles. You know, he's like Idi Amin, the cook with all the ladles. And now here we are, the biggest country in the world, one of the most sophisticated democracies, one of the most sophisticated economies rather, sorry. He's gone back to one-man rule, single-man dictatorship, no legalism, and state-dominated economy. So he's been renationalising, if you like. He's been extending the assets of the state and making it clear that the state will always have leadership in the economy. So that long-winded way of me saying don't trust China watchers, whatever they tell you, it's the only thing you can be confident of is it's likely to be wrong.
Yeah, I think we entered into a new kind of paradigm post-Tiananmen, and I'm thinking specifically of the way that John Howard approached it, which was to say, well, you know, we're not going to, let's not have a discussion about where we differ on values. Let's just get on with what we can do together, which is trade and develop together. That paradigm worked for a long time, worked under John Howard and some time afterwards, but it seems to me that we've got to the point now where we just can't live in that sort of separate world. You know, we cannot separate our trade relationship from our values relationship, can we?
Well, that's right. And the conundrum that China has presented us. So I think you're right, Nick, and I'd say we got into another new paradigm when Xi Jinping consolidated power, because the Chinese state became much more ruthless. It's not just that we can't reconcile our values any longer with our trade. The modern state, led by Beijing, does things which infringe our interests, which we cannot ignore. It engages in massive cyber attack and cyber theft all the time of our data, of our technology, of our military and trade secrets. We have to protect against that. It engages in very extensive interference in our political system. We have to guard against that. It has occupied in the South China Sea an area greater than the Mediterranean and claimed it all as internal Chinese waters, which means that any day that it feels like it could simply flick the switch and say there's no safe passage for merchant ships. It has engaged in the most massive peacetime military build-up we've seen in many decades. It has, through its Belt Road Initiative, trapped a lot of impoverished third world countries, and including its attempt to do so in the South Pacific in a debt trap diplomacy, where it gives them loans for non-productive assets which they cannot pay back, and then uses that to gain leverage, sometimes to gain ports or to gain military bases. So we've had to combat that in the South Pacific. So even if you wanted to ignore our values altogether, even if we were relaxed about the 1 million Uyghurs going into concentration camps, the root and branch terrible suppression of Christianity, the jailing of all human rights lawyers, even if that didn't turn we didn't turn a hair at all that, China is doing things which hurt our national interests, which we have to resist. At the same time, you have to acknowledge that 35 or 40% of our merchant exports, our merchandise exports go to China at the moment, and so it's a very important economic relationship still. So those are the tangled difficulties we have to deal with.
Yeah. So how do we manage those two? It seems to me that what's become apparent is that a lot of Australian companies, Australian exporters and importers had anticipated something like this might occur and have begun to diversify their supply chains and their export markets to other countries like Asia, like India, for example. Is that true? Have enough companies seen this coming, or are we now in a position where if trade relationship got worse, Australian companies and by implication the Australian economy would be in some considerable trouble?
So I think all of the above, Nick. I think all of the above is true. The diversification of supply chains has been a much more important trend with other countries than it has with Australia, with Japan, with the United States. That's because we buy things from China, but we don't have much productive capacity in China. There's not a string of Australian factories that are owned in China. I think we've been slow and incompetent in diversifying our trade away from China. And I'll give you Exhibit A, Nick, one that I know you're very familiar with, the Adani mine. We needed to develop a strategic trading relationship with India. So India, in the shape of Adani, said it's going to make a massive, big investment in Australia, develop a huge coal field and all the ancillary stuff around it, freight railways, are going to be thousands and thousands and thousands of Australian jobs, guaranteed exports to India. And it was the first step in what should have been a big road to India becoming the kind of strategic partner of Australia, which Japan was and which China was economically. And what did we do? We, Australia, subjected it to the most grotesque obstruction and green warfare, green lawfare, water torture, delaying the project for 10 years. And I was writing columns all this time telling Australia that we had to diversify our economic linkages away from China. The federal government ministers would ring me occasionally and say, you're right, mate, but look, we're trying to do it with Adani, and the Queensland government has buggered us, the courts have buggered us, the Green movement has buggered us. So I don't think we've done nearly enough. The other thing, Nick, is our trade with China is much less sophisticated than it's made out to be. It's really iron ore and coal and students, and iron ore and coal are the overwhelming bulk of it, and then students and tourists are the only things that you could remotely claim were sophisticated exports. Now, we do some important beef and barley and wine and so on, but the guts of it is a very old-fashioned resources trade of the kind we used to do in the 1950s, although at a higher level. Now, you can rest assured the Chinese don't buy this stuff from us because they've fallen in love with the poems of Banjo Paterson or anything. They do it because we supply at world competitive prices and we're extremely reliable. But I still think we're dangerously over-reliant on the Chinese market. And it's a failure of all governments, really, that we haven't attracted, more Indian and other trade.
Yeah, and look, I think that the universities are probably a very maybe, as you say, a sophisticated export education, but they're not doing it in a particularly sophisticated way. I mean, when you get a group of 8 universities like Sydney, with more than 30% of new graduates this year were due to be from mainland China. That is a very dangerous thing, and surely they should have seen that coming. What do they do now?
Well, Nick, I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. I think the coronavirus is very challenging for the international student market. I don't see, short of a vaccine, how you can have people come into the country unless they do a 2-week quarantine. I mean, we're in the midst of this bushfire in Victoria now. We're into a massive second lockdown, and that is because of the failure of hotel quarantine. Well, I don't see how you can have 100,000 or 200,000 students come into the country. But assuming that we can get back to an international student market, I think the universities are really covered in shame at their performance in the last little while. Way back in 1985, I wrote a front page story for The Australian called The Lies They Tell Our Children, which was about the penetration of curriculum development by the far left. And I must say, it's just got worse since 1985. So we've now had 2 or 3 generations of students just indoctrinated by sub-Marxist, post-Marxist, postmodern rubbish in the humanities. Now, the universities have behaved disgracefully in a whole series of freedom of speech cases. You know, we've seen this Queensland academic for being sacked for being a heretic on climate change. We've seen a student expelled from Queensland University or now suspended because he behaved in a jejune undergraduate way but was critical of the university's relationship with China. Now we've seen the University of New South Wales academic have her article pulled from a website because it was critical of China. So the universities have become financially dependent on China, and they have not lived up to either academic independence or intellectual freedom in the way that they should. They are dangerously over-dependent on China. Peter Varghese, the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Queensland, recognised this in a recent paper, and yet they seem to have done nothing effective to change that, and they seem to be willing to toe China's line at every point. You know, the Vice-Chancellor of Sydney University, Michael Spence, dismissed the Turnbull government's strategic concerns about China as Sinophobic blather, and said there was too much of a return to the white Australia policy in Australian discussion of China. So I think the universities today in Australia are really in a shocking state with their leadership, with the quality of their curriculum, and with their dependence on a authoritarian, quasi-totalitarian government to give them money and grace and favour.
Now, in this whole strategic tension we face with China and trade tension, of course, there's the question of the United States. The extent to which we can expect the United States to continue to be the great stabilising influence in this region. So what's your thoughts on that? What's your thoughts on Trump? And if in the unlikely event, I say ironically, in the unlikely event he's not re-elected, what happens then to America's role in this region?
So Nick, Trump, I think, has been a mixed grill in every aspect of his presidency. I've never seen a president who speaks worse than Trump. And, you know, I used to think of the American president as the secular pope, as it were, the moral leader of the West. And I grieve for the decline in our culture that the West now produces a leader who trash talks all the time. But having said that, a lot of the things that he does are very good. And some of the things that he says are also good. He's done a lot of good and a lot of bad in foreign policy. He has called out China for its trade crimes and misdemeanors. On the other hand, he's been very unstable in his policy towards China. He keeps telling us that he's made a deal with Xi Jinping and then the deal never comes off. According to John Bolton's book, you know, Bolton was his national security advisor. And Bolton, by the way, is a very hard-line right-winger and would have no cultural problems with Trump whatsoever. But he says Trump was always on the brink of selling out Taiwan and neither understood nor valued alliances. Now, I think Trump is very difficult president to interpret because he has some very good instincts and some terrible ignorance. And the American system has laboured heroically to convert his instincts into coherent policy. And as a result, you've got a not bad result in the Pacific. Trump gives us a bigger defence budget than any other president would give us. He calls China out directly and straightforwardly. The Japanese have managed Trump brilliantly. Shinzo Abe and the Japanese system have managed Trump brilliantly. I think Scott Morrison manages Trump pretty well. And Japan and Australia, in a sense, are the two great anchors of the US alliance system in Asia. And both of our nations have really devoted themselves to the US alliance. At the same time, a great deal of the American system is devoted to the alliance system as well. What we'd get from Trump in a second term is anybody's guess. He wouldn't face another election. On the other hand, he'd be scared of impeachment. He might declare war on China, he might make a deal with China, or probably he'd just go along more or less as we've got him, which is okay. He hasn't shut a single overseas base. He's maintained all his commitments in Asia. He's increased the defence cooperation with us, with Japan, with India. So I think that's all right. A word on Biden. Biden is from the wimpish wing of the Democratic Party in foreign policy, and he was wimpish even by the wimpish standards of the Obama White House. He also is terribly incoherent. I mean, these are two very unsatisfactory candidates. You know, any sentence leaves the mouth of Joe Biden and it's likely to derail at any point in a very ugly fashion. You know, he says the strangest things. I mean, Trump says weird things, but they're weird and rational. He's either telling you a lie or he just doesn't know the facts. Biden says things that are so weird you wonder if the computer in the brain is still in charge. You know, he says 150 million Americans have been killed in recent crime violence. Or in a debate, in one of his vice presidential debates, he said he'd chased Hezbollah out of Lebanon. He's been saying these weird things for a long time. Now, the case for Biden is that he'd probably appoint a competent cabinet and he would certainly let the cabinet run. Biden would preside rather than rule, I think. He'd be a very anemic Ronald Reagan style president in that he would let his cabinet secretaries run. But there is a bit of a civil war going on right now amongst Biden's foreign policy advisors. I think the danger is that you'd get Biden, you know, making kumbaya agreements with the Chinese about climate change or something, just like Obama did, and leaving the strategic stuff fall to one side. And the reason we're in this mess with China is partly because of Obama. You know, China was very hesitant and cautious when it first started moving into the South China Sea, but because it got no reaction from Obama at all, it just kept going further and further and further. So Biden could end up okay if he appoints decent people. That's not beyond the realm of possibility. On the other hand, he could do a lot of damage to the American economy if he implements the socialist platform that he signed up to. But here's a very unsatisfactory answer, Nick. With both these guys, one 78 and one a sprightly 74, we actually have very little idea of how they're going to behave, whoever gets elected come November.
Well, thank you as ever, Greg, for your incisive commentary. Always good to talk to you, and I hope you can join us again on Watercooler.
Thanks a lot, Nick. Really great to talk to you. All the best.